So, given the situation they were in, how did that victory happen? Because everyone knows that in the end, the Republican side lost the war. Why did they lose? If they had everything in their favor, everything was going their way.
They didn't know how to use the resources they had. Simply put, one side managed to get oil, so to speak, out of nowhere, while the others, on the other hand, squandered the huge advantage they had. That's one main reason. The other is one zone's division and the other's unity. In the Republican zone, in the Popular Front zone, it was extremely heterogeneous. We have to make a very short summary of the matter, as brief as possible. We have the left-wing Republicans, the Hassania group. We could say on one side, we have the Socialist Party. At the same time, divided into two large groups, although in reality there were almost three, but anyway, into two large groups, a smaller one, the Reformists, and a larger one, the Revolutionaries. Among the Bolsheviks, we have two different communist forces, the Partido Comunista de España and the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista. One communist force, the Partido Comunista de España, obedient to Moscow, orthodox in its pro-Soviet Marxism, and a Bolshevik force, the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, but it was opposed to Moscow. So to clarify, we have heterodox communists, anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, Basque nationalists, Catalan nationalists, and two groups. Look, the Basque nationalists, for example, are very religious, extremely conservative, and they're racist. They're with the anarchists and communists. Just imagine that. Catalan nationalism is split into two main groups, the conservative Liga Regionalista and the Esquerra Republicana. Well, the Liga Regionalista sides with Franco to such an extent, and for the most part, the Partido Nacionalista Vasco does too, to such an extent that the first intelligence service in Spain, in Nationalist Spain, is called Servicio de Información del Frente del Norte de España, and it's the intelligence service of northern Spain. Francesc Cambó, leader of the Catalanist Liga Regionalista, funds it. And in the Partido Nacionalista Vasco, there are many, a large part of the Partido Nacionalista Vasco also sides with Franco in Álava and Navarra.
Because they opposed the Marxist revolution.
Of course.
That's what would happen today. If there were independent movements, they'd end up fighting each other due to Bildu and the Partido Nacionalista Vasco. Let's see their involvement, but that's another topic.
But it has a lot to do with it. It really does, right? So, of course, the tensions are enormous. Some want libertarian communism, others prefer a syndicalist society, etc. Also, the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo's Zaragoza Confederal Congress in May 1936 outlined its future vision. That's quite interesting historically, isn't it? The others wanted a Bolshevik revolution, but let's say in service of Moscow, while others, on the other hand, wanted a Bolshevik revolution opposed to Moscow and without having anything to do with it. And well, the Socialist Party was itself divided. The others were bourgeois Republicans, so in short, they had nothing to do with each other.
On the national side, yes, there was unity.
Yes.
And what was the unity? I mean, what was it that united that side?
Well, look, basically the need to survive.
They were almost all Catholic Christians, right?
Yes, but those who rebel do so because, as a historian like Stanley Payne has said, there comes a moment when they perceive that it's more dangerous not to rebel than to do so, and so they rebel. Of course, because they see, right, since the things they believe in or the things they want are in danger. Their own lives are in danger. As a result, they support the military rebellion when the coup fails and becomes a civil war. On the other side, we find Alfonsist monarchists, let's say, supporters of Alfonso XIII, who later on, where Francoism will eventually split, into Juanistas, who back Don Juan, and Carlists, who support his son Juan Carlos. There are traditionalist Carlists who also have a monarchist idea at their core. Logically, what happens is that their last two claimants end up dying almost one after the other, and they don't really know which way to go. In that sense, they are also very different, at least initially, from the Alfonsine monarchists, and they have a dynastic dispute between them. This is also an important fact, but for the Carlists, the fundamental thing is the Catholic conception, not only of politics, but of existence itself. Are the conservatives, generally speaking, the great mass of the national zone that identified with the FEDA, with the position that Gil Robles had, a very strong base, also the Calvo Sotelo National Bloc. There's a Falangist group from the Falange, which was originally small, as the Falange didn't get any parliamentary seats in February 1936. Jose Antonio served in parliament from 33 to 36 in the Cortes. Though not a monarchist, he was elected through the monarchist union's candidacy. In 36, he led the Falange as national chief and ran as a Falangist, but wasn't elected to parliament. The Falange was very small until then, but starting in February of 36, the Falange began to grow with enormous strength. Why? Well, because as we've said before, it's the only combative force. And the situation in society is so tense, so violent, that above all, the right-wing groups see in the Falange the only possibility to stand up to the widespread and unleashed violence from the left. The Falange started growing rapidly from February 1936, but after the outbreak of the war in July of 36, the Falange becomes the most attractive force in the entire nationalist zone. Why? Well, because it's a very dynamic and youthful force, and therefore very well suited to the wartime context. Because it's a very combative force and also very well suited to the wartime context. And because it's a force. Is it then perceived as the most modern force of all? It's a force connected to other successful groups in Europe. It's, as we'd say today, fascist in nature, to be clear. The Falange calls itself non-fascist, and Jose Antonio also says it is not fascist. But anyway, it does have a connection, let's say, with the forces that at that time were on the rise in Europe and that in many places were succeeding. And it is the most attractive force in all of nationalist Spain. In fact, the number of volunteers who enlist in the Falange units is the highest. Of everyone in the war, from both sides, of everyone in the war. The Carlists also have a large number of volunteers, but the number of volunteers that the Falange provides is greater for the reasons mentioned. Well, all those groups, which also have differences among themselves in the nationalist zone, were able, with occasional clashes but very marginal ones, to unite around the need to win the war. And once the war is won, then we'll see what the victorious state should be like, but first we have to win the war, and that's the most important thing. On the other side, however, they didn't have that idea, not even close. In fact, there were two main groups, so to speak. One was those who wanted to win the war first and then deal with politics once victory was achieved. And those who, on the contrary, wanted to make the revolution first and then win the war. This second group, which seems absurd, you wouldn't focus on making a revolution during a war. On a theoretical level, it's not so absurd. Why? Well, because if the revolution is superior to the world that's being destroyed, let's call it capitalism, just to be clear. If socialism is superior to capitalism, then the sooner we reach socialism, the better, because we'll achieve superiority over the capitalist world. Well, in theory, this could be, in quotes, plausible, but in practice, of course, it was an absolute disaster. And then in the Popular Front zone, in the Republican zone, what was established was chaos in every aspect, which was very difficult for the authorities to get under control. During the early months of the war, what characterized, and actually for most of the war to a large extent in the Republican zone, was disorder, chaos. In short, it all seemed truly tumultuous. Those were the main reasons for their defeat.
The defeat was largely due to divisions among the left, who couldn't get along. I heard there were even conflicts within the Republican side, right?
As we mentioned before, there were two civil wars within the Republican side. Look, before the two civil wars, the first one being in May of 37, there were clashes between groups identifying as anti-fascists. Until January of 37, that is for 6 months, it's estimated that around 400 anti-fascist militants died at the hands of each other. And they were anarchists and communists, socialists and anarchists, anarchists and socialists. Leftists were also killing each other, including members of the Republican left, anarchists and communists.
Luis Companys also killed many people in Catalonia.
He presided over Catalonia, the Generalitat, and as a result, of course, he had a butt. That confrontation lasted until January of 37, when there still wasn't an open conflict between the left-wing groups. It still wasn't open. We're talking about 400 murders from then on, plus two civil wars. One in May 37 in Barcelona, and another in March 39 in Madrid. Two civil wars within the civil war. War between the leftist groups, between those who called themselves anti-fascists. So let's say the killings among them were constant, but even before the civil war, they were already doing it. In the spring of 36, the clashes between factions of the Partido Socialista Obrero Español within the same party were extremely frequent and in some cases ended in death. Indalecio Prieto, I think I remember that in Écija he had to run away after a rally because the radical socialists, those of Largo Caballero, wanted to kill him. And then he created a group called the Motorizada, mainly to protect himself from other socialists. I mean, that's how divided they were among themselves.